Good morning, everyone. My name is Dave Bowman. I'm a data analyst in the Business Intelligence Unit here at the Winnipeg Police Service. I'm here today to present key findings, observations, and highlights found within the 2023 Statistical Report. My presentation, along with the report itself, is centered on 4 key themes: complement and demographics, calls for service, criminal code offenses, and clearance rates. I'm happy to share that this report has undergone a major change in terms of format and delivery in 2023. The Business Intelligence Unit at WPS, with support from Esri Canada, has moved the report from a static magazine-style document to a web-based interactive site hosted within the ArcGIS Hub platform. I'll provide a brief demonstration of the site at the conclusion of this briefing. Looking first at our complement. In 2023, the WPS had an authorized complement of 1,366 police officers, up 10 from the previous year, along with 561 professional staff members, the same as the previous year, totaling 1,927 events in 2023, an increase of 5.6% over 2022 and 6.2% over the 5-year average, another historic high. Emergency dispatched events decreased from 2022, but remained above the 5-year average. And finally, non-dispatched events, or the events we didn't get to, increased for the 3rd year in a row and also reached a historic high in 2023. Looking more closely at our calls for service and specifically citizen-generated events, these continued to trend upwards in 2023, increasing by 4.9% over 2022. Check Wellbeing remained the top citizen-generated event for the 4th year in a row, followed by domestic events, disturbances, suspicious persons, and family trouble. Following 2 years of decline through the pandemic, proactive police-initiated events increased by 8.2% over 2022, driven primarily by an increase in traffic stops. Outside of calls to 911, our non-emergency line at 986-6222, and proactive events initiated by WPS members, citizens of Winnipeg can also report a range of crimes online through our website. WPS received nearly 40,000 online reports in 2023. In addition to online reporting, officers use video technology to take reports rather than dispatching a cruiser car to respond in person. The number of virtual police responses continued to trend upward in 2023. And looking at the proportion and types of crimes reported online, Nearly half of all crimes were reported online in 2023, including a majority of property crimes. The most common types of crimes reported online were mischief, theft from motor vehicle, shoplifting, and fraud. Moving now to our criminal code crime statistics. A couple of brief notes on how we count and categorize the crime stats contained in this report. These are crimes reported to police, and we don't consider other collection methods in this particular report. For example, community surveys or self-reported victimization surveys. As far as how we count crime, the methodology used in this report is aligned with Statistics Canada and the parameters set out in the Uniform Crime Reporting Survey. In 2023, total crime in Winnipeg decreased by 2.2% over 2022, but remained above the 5-year average. The decrease in total crime was driven primarily by a reduction in property crime, which saw a 6.7% decrease over 2022, and falling back below pre-pandemic levels observed in 2019. Violent crime is the exception, as we really didn't see any downturn during the pandemic and continued to see an upward trend in 2023, increasing by 12.1% over 2022 and by 31.4% over the 5-year average. For the second year in a row, violent youth crime continued to increase at a rate higher than that of total violent crimes. Finally, other crimes, which are comprised primarily of bail and probation violations, along with traffic crimes and drug crimes, all saw year-over-year percentage increases. Moving now from crime volume trends to crime severity. The Crime Severity Index considers both the volume and the seriousness of crime. In the calculation of the CSI, each offense is assigned a weight derived from average sentences handed down by the criminal courts. The more serious the average sentence, the higher the weight of that offense. These indices are useful in that they give us a clearer picture of crime severity than do simple counts or rates. As well, these indices control for population growth, allowing for meaningful comparisons over time and across jurisdictions. So in addition to the overall decrease in the volume of crime observed in 2023, total crime severity also decreased by 4.6% over 2022, driven primarily by an 8.9% reduction in nonviolent crime severity. Violent crime severity continued to trend upward in 2023, increasing by 2.2% over the previous year. In looking at the long-term trend dating back to the late 90s, violent crime severity in Winnipeg peaked in 2009. 2023 is now the second highest in terms of violent crime severity on record, slightly below and nearly on par with 2009. Total crime severity and nonviolent crime severity are higher than the previous decade, but remain below levels seen in the late 90s and early 2000s. So looking back to 2022, Winnipeg ranked first nationally in total crime severity, second in violent crime severity behind Thunder Bay, and third nationally in nonviolent crime severity behind Lethbridge and Kelowna. And while national data on 2023 crime severity won't be available until July, early indications are that other prairie cities have had similar experiences to that of Winnipeg. Edmonton, for example, recently reported an overall decrease in its crime rate. However, increases in total crime severity driven by violent crime increases. Turning now to violent crimes. Some notable year-over-year increases in 2023 include assaults up 17%, robberies up 22%, and assaults on police officers up 17%. Some notable decreases include homicides that are down to 46 from a record high 53 in 2022, sexual assaults down 7%, and other sexual offenses down 25%. Following a record high in 2022, the use of bear spray in violent crimes decreased sharply in 2023, down nearly 25%. While crimes involving knives, firearms, and other weapons all increased compared to 2022. It's worth noting that tighter regulations related to the sale and purchase of bear spray were enacted by the province in spring 2023. Prior to this, 2023 was on pace for another record year in terms of violence involving bear spray, trending up over 50% in the first quarter of 2023. Following the enactment of the new regulations, the use of bear spray in violent crimes dropped nearly 40% for the remainder of the year and continues to decline rapidly into 2024. Similar to previous years, the majority of weapons crimes took place in the downtown and Point Douglas communities. It's important to note that community boundaries are drawn and governed by the City of Winnipeg. Looking further at violent crimes involving weapons, the majority of violent crimes involved physical force, with smaller proportions involving specific weapons, including knives, bear spray, and firearms. Alternatively, over 2/3 of homicides involved a knife or a firearm. Of the 15,000 violent crimes in 2023, over 2,000, or 14%, could not be solved because the victim refused to participate in the investigation. And similar to previous years, the victim and accused were unknown to each other in nearly half of all violent crimes. When looking at violent crimes by the status of the accused, similar to previous years, nearly 1 in 5 violent crimes cleared by charge involved an accused person violating their bail, probation, or other similar court order. It's worth noting that federal bail reform was enacted in January 2024 and will likely take some time to understand whether those reforms will have the desired impact on this figure. As mentioned previously, both violent crime volume and severity continued to trend upward in 2023, driven primarily by year-over-year increases in robberies and assaults. Specifically, the increase in robberies tie in with some of the property crime trends that we've experienced over the past year. So looking at property crimes now, the majority of property crime categories experienced year-over-year decreases. Some notable decreases include break and enters, down nearly 13%, mischief, down nearly 16%, and theft from motor vehicle, down nearly 25%. Theft from motor vehicle was driven primarily by a significant reduction in catalytic converter thefts. Similar to the bear spray trend, there were changes introduced by the province to the Scrap Metal Act in July 2022, paired with targeted enforcement initiatives by WPS that correlate with the drastic decrease in these thefts. The notable exceptions to the overall decrease in property crimes are shoplifting and fraud. Shoplifting has doubled since 2021, but remains below 2019 and 2020 levels that were characterized primarily by liquor store thefts. Personal accessories, including clothing, became the most reported stolen item in 2023, overtaking vehicle accessories, including catalytic converters, which had been the most reported stolen item for the previous 2 years. Turning now to youth crime. Youth crimes continued to trend upward in 2023, increasing 23.1% over 2022 and by 14.3% over the 5-year average. After declining steadily for a number of years, this is the second year in a row where youth crime has increased. In addition to the overall increase in youth crimes, as I've mentioned already, violent youth crime continued to increase at a rate higher than that of total violent crimes. Youth violent crimes involving a weapon have also doubled since 2021, with youth accounting for 1 in 5 persons charged with a weapons crime. Looking now at our clearance rates. Clearance rates across all crime categories increased in 2023 with a total increase of 2.9%. I'll note that we saw increases across all categories in terms of both proportion as well as the volume of crimes that were solved. As far as investigating the most serious crimes in our city, of the 46 homicides in 2023, 37 were cleared, or just over 80%. It's worth noting that homicide clearance rates in Winnipeg have remained above 80% since 2011. Winnipeg has consistently been well above the national average with respect to homicide clearance rates, which is truly a testament to the hard work and dedication of our talented investigators. So to summarize, in 2023, total calls to the Communications Center increased over the previous year, as well as the 5-year average, with an average of over 2,000 calls received to the WPS Communications Center every day. Dispatched events for service also reached a record high in 2023. Total crimes decreased slightly over 2022, driven primarily by a reduction in property crimes. The majority of property crimes saw decreases, with the notable exceptions of fraud and shoplifting. Violent crimes were the exception and continued to trend upward in 2023, increasing for the 3rd year in a row. And similar to previous years, nearly 1 in 5 violent crimes cleared by charge involved an accused person breaching their conditions. Violent youth crimes continued to increase at a higher rate than that of total violent crimes. And finally, clearance rates across all crime categories increased in 2023. So with that concludes the technical piece of my briefing. I'll just take a couple moments now to demonstrate the Statistical Report website. So the Stat Report website is structured similarly to this briefing as well as previous year's reports, with the reader being able to explore police data related to complement, calls for service, and criminal code offenses. We've also added some additional explanation on how data flows through our organization and ends up displayed in the Statistical Report. In addition to the mobile-friendly web layout, we wanted to ensure there was something for everyone in terms of format and delivery. So in addition to the regular categories that we've discussed, complement and demographic, calls for service, criminal code offenses, we've also grouped this information in different delivery modes. So we have summary infographics with associated narratives and interpretation of the data, an interactive crime dashboard that allows users to explore crime trends at the city, community, and neighborhood levels on their desktop or mobile device, a magazine-style PDF document for those who prefer to print and read in a more traditional format. For those who want additional detail on the data, we've provided downloadable data tables as well. Just demonstrating the dashboard piece right now. Finally, for those who want to study the raw data, downloads are available through our public-facing crime maps and calls for service maps. We hope this presents an enhanced user experience and allows us to better tell our story. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions you might
have. Very thorough, by the way. I've been at this for a few years. We saw on bear spray and certainly on catalytic converters, but on bear spray, for example, have we seen statistically a weapon of choice after bear spray? Because we've often found that once one thing is eliminated, we'll see something else kind of be gravitated to. Does the data at all reflect that?
So we have seen upticks in, for example, other weapons, which is kind of a catch-all category. It can mean just about anything: baseball bats, pool cues, screwdrivers, broken bottles. So we have seen upticks in other weapons as well as firearms and knives. It's hard to distinguish whether it's people moving from bear spray to those other items, but so while we have seen a reduction in bear spray crimes, we have seen upticks in the use of other weapons.
So you were mentioning as well, just with the decrease in certain property crimes, have you seen a shift at all? Let's say now it's harder to steal a catalytic converter. Have you seen a shift at all from people going from that into other areas of crime?
So it's tough to distinguish, what at the individual level if people are moving from one crime category to the next. But what we have seen, for example, is, in line with the decrease that we've seen in theft from motor vehicle driven by those catalytic converter thefts, we have seen a notable increase in shoplifting. It doesn't mean to say that those are causal in terms of their relation, but there certainly is a correlation.
Do you have a breakdown of those shoplifting thefts? How many of those were violent or involved assault?
So when a shoplifting goes bad and turns violent, that becomes a robbery. So we have seen an uptick in robberies as well. So we kind of see the increase in shoplifting go hand in hand with the increase in robberies that we've seen throughout the city as well.
Regarding the severity of violent crimes, do you take into account what proportion of violent crimes led to a victim needing medical care or hospitalization? We just take into account the severity of the sentence.
Yeah, so for example, an aggravated assault, which is a more serious type of assault, and that can be in some ways connected to the outcomes of the victim, that is treated as a more severe crime in the crime severity index than that of a common assault, for example. So it does take those kind of factors into account.
But not the medical aspect, only the charges that were laid and the sentence, or also the length of hospitalization or the care they need.
Yeah, it's specific to the average sentence lengths handed down for that specific criminal occurrence.
For the violent youth crime increase, how much was the increase specifically for violent?
If you give me a moment, I can pull that number out for you. So looking at youth violent crimes specifically, up 15.9% year over year and 43.4% over the 5-year average.
And at some point, this may move to the superintendents, but, great data here. How is this data now being used as a predictive tool to where to place resources? That might be for one of the superintendents, but what you're doing here is obviously driving a lot of intelligent policing here.
Yeah, from my perspective, so what you see here is not much unlike the internal products that we develop through the business intelligence unit. So the interactive crime maps, that kind of detailed data availability. This is the tip of the iceberg, obviously, for public use. Internally, we have a lot of products and metrics that we serve to our executive team to help them make better informed decision-making. We are a data-driven organization. We are an intelligence-led organization. And if one of the superintendents wanted to speak to that.
I'll just speak very quickly. You probably heard me speak in the last couple of weeks about Project Surge, which was specifically a youth violent crime directed project. It was driven based on data and analysis that was coming out of the business intelligence unit over the course of 2023, as well as a lot of hard work of officers in the frontline uniform operations division, linking specific offenders with each other, determining how they were interacting, where they were meeting, and what they were up to. And so it resulted in, again, the business intelligence unit putting together an easy-to-use dashboard for frontline officers to have information at their fingertips to know who they need to focus on in order to address the violent crime trend that we are seeing amongst the youth.
But beyond that, Dave, what are we looking at as far as shoplifting, those other areas? Because this can be applied to so many things that are quasi-organized.
It can be applied across the whole range of services, right? And that's why we are data-driven. We only have so many resources. You've seen that from the first slide. So we need to be very focused in where we focus our resources and make sure that we're making the greatest impact with the officers we have.
So is it paying off as far as arrest rates are concerned? Like, are you starting to be able to say, okay, now we're getting it? Because you should be able to see that on arrest rates and on clearance rates, depending on the type of category of crime that you're looking at and resources.
Yeah, so I'll speak only to the surge part because that's the part I've been into lately. And yeah, the arrests have been focused on youth causing the most crime. But like I've said, we can't arrest our way out of this problem in the community. These crime problems need to be solved in partnership with other levels of government and community stakeholders. We'll never police our way out of this, what's happening in our community. We need other solutions that are addressing the root causes. And what we can bring to partners is the data and the information that we can work with collaboratively to solve these problems together.
What, in terms of any assistance from governments or stakeholders, as you put it, what can help? What does police service need?
Well, it's a pretty broad question, so maybe I'll restrict my remarks to the youth violent crime that I'm addressing, but it'll apply to a wide range of issues, right? So I had identified that of the youth violent crime Project Surge offenders, the top 30 offenders were involved in 50,
Quarter to a third of all.
quarter to a third of all youth crime in the whole city. So working with government to try to determine what supports do those 30 youth need to put them on a different path such that they're not out offending day in and day out, which is chasing and arresting and releasing and arresting and releasing. What's going to get them off their path that they're on? And that can be applied across a number of crime categories,
And
shoplifting, etc.
Mr. Bowman mentioned that youth account for 1 in 5 people charged with a weapons crime. How tied into that are those 30 youth that you have mentioned with Project Surge?
they're just about always armed with a weapon when we arrest them.
And would those youth potentially be supplying the other youth with weapons? Like you mentioned last week in your presentation that they are bringing in other youths to, I guess, to their organizations. So are those directly related to that uptick in youth with weapons?
I'm not sure I can speak to that in terms of direct cause. They're certainly meeting up. They're all armed. They're shoplifting together, stealing weapons together, and then going and committing crime. So even when they're not armed, when they meet up, part of their shoplifting has been, we've seen, going to steal machetes.
What's driving that increase in youth crime, violent youth crime?
Well, now we're getting to the youth, the root causes, right? And we're talking about what is their home situation? Are they going to school? Do they have the supports in the home? Why are they out all hours of the night with other youth? Who's watching them? Like, so these are the kind of conversations we need to look at, a whole wraparound services of these youth to find out what's driving them into this lifestyle and what's going to get them out of this lifestyle. And in some cases, it might be incarceration for some, for a period of time until we can get them into the proper support programs. And that's why we need to work with government.
When, with that 1 in 5 persons charged with a weapon as a youth, what kind of weapons, is there a weapon that you're seeing more when it's youth?
I don't know the data well enough to speak to that intelligently. I'm sorry.
There was a mention of another increase in youth violent crime, like year over year. Do you know the long-term data? Like, is that a record, or what would be the record year? Do you know?
It's not a record by any stretch. So what we've seen since the enactment of the Youth Criminal Justice Act in 2003 is a very steady decline in rates of overall youth offending as well as violent youth offending. So it's really just been the last 2 years that we've seen those notable upticks in youth crime overall, as well as youth crime in terms of violent crime specifically. And to answer your question about the use of specific weapons for youth, bear spray, I think there's a bit of a breakdown in the stat report. The proportions that youth are accountable for of persons charged, and I think bear spray is right around 43%. So just under half of all bear spray crimes in the city where there's been an offender identified involve youth. So in terms of those proportions, other weapons like firearms and knives are closer to a quarter or a fifth. So those would be the major themes and weapons that we see for youth specifically.
I have a question regarding the volume of calls coming in and how that's kind of being handled from a 911 comms kind of perspective as well, just in the sense of with that much volume and the number of calls that we're seeing on let's check up on somebody. Talk a little bit about the mental health component of this, because that's going to be an issue, and is an issue certainly for the next chief on how that gets dispatched. There's always been the default position if there's any threat of violence, police are going as well. What is the service looking at? What do you need to look at long-term to start addressing those numbers? We have the Downtown Community Safety Partnership. They're involved in with dispatch on the fire side in some cases. Those volumes continue to go up. How do you deal with it at the front end? From a policing perspective, there's other partners there, but what are you looking at from a policing perspective?
So I'll just say that the mental health crisis in the community is woven in with the meth crisis, because what we're seeing is people who are on meth acting in a manner that they never would normally act. And they're often violent, often unpredictable. And that is one of the largest strains on our frontline resources right now, is dealing with those folks in crisis and the challenge of where to take them and who can deal with them. There's not a lot of our shelters that are, I'll say, trained and staffed to deal with folks on meth. And so what often happens is our officers end up sitting with those folks in hospital, waiting for them to come down off their high until they're acting reasonably enough to be assessed by medical staff. Sometimes at that point, it's time to release them because they actually aren't suffering from a mental health crisis. They were just on drugs. So we have to find a different way to deal with that. And it's one of our greatest challenges right now.
I'm not sure which superintendent would be able to speak to this, but extortion, the numbers here, it's up almost 3 times compared to last year, 5 times over the 5-year average. It has a very low clearance rate. What is this service doing to kind of combat that trend?
David, if you could remind me, just repeat the question, extortion?
Absolutely.
What is the
So
number just?
extortion is up 184.2% compared to last year and 482.7% compared to the 5-year average.
Maybe we'll let, if David could speak to the data, maybe I could respond to it.
Yep.
I'm assuming we're dealing with smaller numbers there.
So one of the dynamics we see in terms of those large percent increases is smaller numbers. So I think the extortion numbers specifically, I think they're about under 200 for the year. That said, we have seen about a tripling of extortion over the last 3 years, and that's really driven by online activities. And Superintendent will be able to speak to it, I think. But yeah, so it is somewhat of an effect of small numbers, but we are seeing a lot more crime moving online, driven by the cybercrime element. And a lot of these extortion files do involve sexual extortion as well. So fishing out intimate images over online platforms like Snapchat, WhatsApp, and kind of coming at it from that angle. So that's one of the things that I see in the data in terms of driving that trend upward. But I would just say somewhat a cautionary note in terms of the interpretation of the percent changes specifically, in that we are dealing with smaller numbers.
I don't know if I can add to that, to be honest. Yeah, and you covered it.
Is anyone able to speak to the increase in the use of knives and firearms in crimes? Kind of what's driving that, and maybe how that also compares to a long trend?
Firearms, pretty consistent from the data perspective. Again, we are dealing with smaller numbers. I think we're less than 500 crimes committed with firearms. I'd have to double check the figures. Maybe don't quote me on that one. But certainly knives have seen a large uptick year over year. Pretty much everything but bear spray in terms of those weapons have seen a year over year increase. So overall, things are trending up with the use of weapons, but we are seeing some positive trends in terms of the bear spray specifically.
Can you speak a little to what you're seeing when it comes to hate-motivated crimes?
Yeah, so in terms of hate-motivated crimes, there were 46 hate-motivated crimes reported to police in 2023. That is a recent historic high. Again, we're dealing with smaller numbers here, 46 up from, I think, 20 or 30 last year. So while we're dealing with smaller numbers in Winnipeg, what I can say in the broader national context is that we are seeing an uptick nationally in hate crimes across the country. So I don't think our experience here in Winnipeg is that much different from elsewhere in the country.
And what do they fall under when you have the big breakdown? Is it under other crimes, or what does it fall that?
It depends on the nature of the charge. So they could be violent crimes if there's a hate-motivated assault. We've seen a lot of hate-motivated property crimes as well. Distribution of hate propaganda, for example. So it can fall into either the property crime category or the violent category, just depending on the nature of the crime.
Do you have the clearance rate for the hate-motivated crimes?
Not specifically offhand, but I could get that for you.
Does Winnipeg Police track the percentage of youth crime that results in incarceration?
Offhand, no. It's something we could certainly look into as well.
More questions?
Yeah, the most significant, or the increase in violent crime, and any of the, speak to what we've seen last year over the previous year. It seemed a very significant increase. I'm just wondering if any of the can speak to that.
Say a couple words, please.
Okay. And I don't know who you are.
Sorry, Superintendent Cam McKidd.
Would you spell it?
It's MACKID. Yeah, so sorry, your question is with respect to violent crime. I think we've all seen it over the past year. There's been a lot of high-profile incidents. We've seen it with youth crime. Superintendent Dalal spoke to that and the service's response to that with Project Surge. I think we made a lot of headway there. The adult part of it, I can tell you what we're doing about it because we do see it in the media quite often. We speak quite often about our capacity to handle these calls, and I think our calls for dispatch are over 250,000 per year. So we have to be very careful with our resources, and we're very grateful to the province of Manitoba, for Manitoba Justice, for funding a number of initiatives and integrated units that help us combat issues like the one you're talking about with violent crime. One of these funded integrated units is the violent offender unit. They've been up and running for about a year now. So they focused on violent offenders, and this is what you're talking about, sir. Extreme violence. So in the past year, since it's an integrated unit with the RCMP, so we've got a number of members that focus on violent crime. They've had 400 arrests in the past year. And those arrests are focusing on the most violent of criminals. These are people who are out on parole or who are on bail. They have conditions, gang members, gang associates, that sort of thing. So very effective. And in addition to those 400 arrests, they've had over 1,000 checks where they will go to, they'll check on violent offenders. They'll do warrant checks. They'll do checks for conditions that they might be breaching. Quite often those don't result in arrests, but it also shows that segment of society that somebody's watching them, that somebody is keeping track of their conditions and their warrants. So there's some suppression, I think, to that sort of action. So I think part of our job here today is to tell you how we're addressing some of these things. And that unit's been extremely effective. They travel throughout Manitoba. The majority of their work is within the city of Winnipeg, but they'll travel up to Flin Flon or Thompson. They've actually traveled outside of Manitoba as well. So very effective. So a good example of what could be done with additional funding to provide us additional resources above and beyond what we normally have day to day.
How much more could you use? And good on you for going outside the city of Winnipeg, because there was a while there that they would be in Winnipeg, move just outside the city and go, haha, you can't get us. And that's changed with the integrated unit.
For sure. And, another example, I'm not sure if it's along the lines of this question, but the missing persons unit is being expanded right now. So that's another funded initiative where we're getting extra financial resources. We're getting extra human resources from the RCMP, from First Nations policing, from Child and Family Services. So we're going to be able to have a better response, an integrated response province-wide with respect to missing persons. So just another example of how funding can help us broaden our reach.
What does that do for recruits though? Like, at the front here, it was, wait a minute, there's only a certain amount of resources here. I've never talked to a chief or a superintendent that would say, no, we don't need any more people.
Yeah.
But there's a balance, right?
100%. Yeah, and that's the discussions we have all the time as an executive group is here's a fantastic offer of resources, of funding, but we have to manage that. And, it can be very difficult because the officers we put into these units, like for instance, the violent offender unit, these are experienced officers that we're pulling from potentially the front lines. So now they're seconded to a unit that's integrated, doing fantastic work, but we have to backfill those. So we're finding now we're having to make tough decisions when it's fantastic that we have these opportunities for financing, but we have to take a real serious look if we have the capacity to, we're pushing things forward a little bit. Like right now, if we had an offer for some more manpower, we might have to push that down a year or 2 years out because we have a number of fantastic initiatives that the province has funded, but we have to fill those spots. So a very, very accurate observation.
The term root causes has come up. What are some of the more common things that are driving crime?
Meth, drugs. Drugs drives a lot of crime in the city, the violent crime for sure. A lot of the retail theft that you see, some of it's related to raising funds to purchase drugs. So drugs is a huge one. And I think Superintendent all spoke to the need for wraparound, some sort of plan to look after some of these kids that are on the street all the time and causing a lot of trouble. So, but drugs for sure. Drugs drives a lot of crime in the city.
When it comes to the retail theft and the increases you've seen in retail theft, and then you spoke a little bit about the spikes that we're seeing when there was the liquor store robberies.
Yeah.
There was a number of initiatives taken then to try to curb or stop those liquor store robberies from
Right.
happening. So now it's shifted, it's a different type of retail theft.
Yeah.
What kind of initiatives are there or could be taken now to try to curb the kind of retail theft that's happening?
Well, you're exactly right. We've looked at the catalytic converter. That was a bit of a crisis there for some time. It was approached by a multi-level approach. It was approached by legislation through government, enforcement with police and investigations with police, and the community. With respect to catalytic converters, there was the community and Crime Stoppers through criminal forfeiture. They funded, it was called, I can't remember now, where you mark the catalytic converter, I can't remember what it's called. Mark your cat, I can't remember what the initiative was called. But anyway, it was a multi-pronged approach. It was government, police, and the community, and the impact of that was unbelievable. When you look at the, like David showed you, I think the statistics. The same thing with retail theft. We can approach it from an enforcement perspective, which we're doing all the time. We're doing it right now. So we can make the arrests. We can have visibility, and I think it's been very well received. The most recent project we're working on, very positive feedback from the community. They'd like to see police, a visible presence in the malls and in stores. But yeah, there has to be something else to it because it's not really sustainable for police or for the funding from the province. So we've been working very closely with the retail council, with business groups, and trying to find strategies. The discussion that's come out of all this, the spotlight on retail theft, has brought about a level of communication that didn't exist before, to be quite honest, between our executive here and the business executives. So at the executive level and also the operational level, we've got investigators at the operational level that go out and do this enforcement. They're now talking on a daily basis with the loss prevention officers at that level. So they're becoming very efficient, very effective at putting projects together, targeting locations, targeting individuals. There's that communication flow that just didn't exist before. So that's been a benefit of the spotlight on retail theft. But going forward, catalytic converters or bear spray, we had great effect with legislation, but those are very narrow problems that were solvable. Not to say retail theft isn't, but it's much more complex. There's apparel, electronics, there's food, there's thousands of different stores, and there's every type of person committing it. So it's more complex, but it's not to say that it's not. We can certainly have a real impact on it. I think we're well underway, to be honest. The communication between us and the retail community is, I'm sure you're hearing that or we're seeing it in the media. I think it's been very positive. And we're just trying to build on that and find out ways with our community relations officers to maybe work on ways they could redesign stores and the ergonomics of stores. You've probably heard this term in the media. So we're looking at multi-pronged approaches to these issues. But I think we're making progress, to be honest. We're trying.
Do you have any numbers on use of force and use of like the crisis unit, crisis response unit?
I don't.
Yeah. Do you know how often it's used, and compared to that, like what, how many interventions led to use of force? What are the outcomes?
So ARC is a team with a clinician teamed up with an officer who go to lower risk, nonviolent mental health calls with the specific objective to provide supports in the community for individuals who can be supported in the community without going through the medical system. So we're trying to avoid the lineups at the medical facilities where the clinician can actually assess what the person's issue is. They have access to the medical records, and they can create a support plan and leave that person with supports in the community. Now, the officer goes along with those for a safety perspective. There's lots of calls where you might be referring to a use of force encounter where those would not be appropriate calls for ARC.
I get that, but how many times were ARC dispatched? Do you have any numbers on use of force aside from that?
For ARC calls or for non-ARC calls?
Well, for ARC, how many times were they dispatched on the?
Oh, I'm afraid I don't have it on top of my head, but we can get to it. Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
And use of force as well? You don't have the numbers of?
Use of force report released at the police board just last week.
Yeah.
You can refer to that.
Question about the youth crime clearance rates here. First off, can you just describe what departmental discretion is in those clearance rates, what that would mean?
So first and foremost, in terms of like clearing youth crimes, all youth crimes are cleared by virtue of we've identified a suspect and identified them as under the age of 17. Departmental discretion is, there's a lot of legislative tools under the Youth Criminal Justice Act that our officers are encouraged to use less formal means when dealing with youth. So that discretion is something that is applied in youth circumstances more often than not.
So on that note, just looking at, since 2019, it looks like the number of clearance status by charge is kind of decreasing and the number cleared by departmental discretion is increasing. Is that a kind of a change in focus when it comes to policing youth crimes?
It's not a change in focus. It's a requirement from the Youth Criminal Justice Act that we release them with the least onerous conditions, and depending on their history with police, that may simply be a warning or a warning letter with the Crown or referral to a program, restorative justice. So not every youth who's arrested gets charged necessarily depending on their history and what the charge is.
I don't know, it might not be you, Superintendent, but is anybody able to give an update on the status of the bail monitoring unit that was proposed earlier? Okay, that's good.
Well, I can speak to it in that discussions are still ongoing with justice on how we're going to roll this out, right? We're not there yet. So I'll say stay tuned. That's all I can say. We're not there yet.
This fall, could it begin this winter? Or?
Potentially, yeah. We still just need to work out a number of details with justice yet.
Anything else? Thank you for coming.